They say every story has two sides, and being a train driver's absolutely no different. On the one hand, you've got passenger train drivers transporting tens of thousands of almost satisfied, mostly happy passengers all around the country. On the other side, you've got Team Freight. Well, actually there's multiple Team Freights. We've got red team, blue team, green team. There's even an orange team in there somewhere. Transporting goods and freight all around the country, keeping the lights turned on at power stations, keeping the shelves stocked with container trains. But as a train driver, which one's better, freight or passenger? Welcome to Dad Rail. Hello and welcome to Dad Rail. If this happens to be the first video you've seen by me, then I'm Richard, freight train driver, former passenger train driver and father to 4 wonderful children who have absolutely no interest in trains, so I've got no idea why this channel is still called Dad Rail. As always, all the opinions and views expressed within this video are solely my own and may not reflect those of any companies I may work for or be associated with. So I know from comments on previous videos and my social media feeds that a lot of people watch these videos to gain an insight into the role of being a train driver and with the possibility of applying to become a train driver in the future. So with that in mind, keep an eye on the channel over the next few weeks. I say weeks, my upload record, it'll probably be months, but I've got a series of videos coming out sort of talking about pathways to becoming a train driver, the assessment process, the interview process, etc, etc, sort of just giving some tips and advice from my experience. So if you are thinking about getting a job as a train driver, one of the things you might consider is whether you want to drive freight trains or whether you want to drive passenger trains. And there are pros and cons to both, and that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. I'll be completely honest with you, I'm going to try not to be biased, but I prefer driving freight trains. I had 7-8 years of driving passenger trains. I've been driving freight trains for around 18 months, 2 years at the time of upload. And yeah, I completely prefer driving freight trains, but I'm going to try and be really unbiased. All the opinions are from my own personal experiences, but I've spoken to quite a lot of other passenger drivers, quite a lot of other freight drivers on various different companies, and I think most people would tend to agree with what I'm going to say. So one of the biggest differences between passenger and freight work, and one of the things that puts a lot of people off freight work, is the differences in shifts. Most TOCs and FOCs, that's train operating company, freight operating company, I'm going to be using the TOC and FOC abbreviation quite a few times, so remember that one. Most TOCs and FOCs normally operate between a 32 and a 37 hour average working week, but that word average in this sense is really, really important. When you work for a passenger company, the very nature of a passenger company is that you run trains to a specific, or you try and run trains to a specific timetable, and that timetable remains the same. Normally they're in sort of 6 months blocks before the timetable changes. So for that 6 months that timetable's in place, maybe with the exception of weekend engineering works and line closures, you know exactly what trains you're running, exactly what manpower you need, and you can plan for that exactly. So as a passenger train driver, I could look at my roster, my shift patterns, and I could generally sort of work out what I'm doing 4 or 5 months in advance. I can tell you exactly what train I'm working, exactly what time I'm going to work, exactly what time I'm finishing, exactly when my days off are, which is absolutely brilliant for planning outside activities and kind of making your life work around the job a little bit. Freight work, on the other hand, tends to be very dynamic, and things can change very quickly. You can have short-term contracts, long-term contracts. You might get weekend engineering trains, summer charter trains, and things can change depending on the needs and demands of the customers. Therefore, it's very difficult to plan the shifts, and with freight work, you generally don't know what you're doing until literally the week before. So sort of planning stuff at home can be very difficult. You tend to know when your days off are. They tend to be fixed. But sort of what shift you're going to be working and what trains you're going to be working, whether you're going to be on night duty, early duty, late duty, it depends on what the company needs, the requirements of the company at the time. So you can be mucked around quite a lot more on freight than what you will be on passenger. That said, I know for a fact from a few of the people I've spoken to that the green team, mentioning no names, just Team Green, a lot of their intermodal drivers, that's the container drivers, do work to set shift patterns because the intermodal, the container trains do run basically to a timetable like passenger trains, so they're able to do that. But with the majority of freight companies and freight depots, you will not know what you're doing until the week before, due to how dynamic and how quickly the work can change and how adaptive you need to be to the industry and the environment. Normally with freight work as well, you can find yourself working a lot more weekends. We do sort of engineering trains and stuff like that. You may also find yourself working a lot more night shifts because generally speaking freight trains tend to run when passenger trains aren't. Although that said, in some areas of course passenger trains are 24/7 hour operations. So on shift patterns and rostering, the point here definitely goes to passenger driving. If you want to know what you're doing in advance, if you want that sort of work-life balance to be a lot better, I would highly recommend you go for passenger work. Freight work, you need to be a lot more flexible. The shifts can be a bit more unsociable. Passenger work, all the way if you want to know exactly what you're doing all the time. For some unknown reason, the footage of me speaking in this section became corrupted. So instead, here is a voiceover, accompanied by a few shots from my recent train spotting adventures for your visual delight. So as I mentioned in the previous section, passenger companies will operate to a timetable, or try to operate to a timetable, over the routes set out in their franchise agreement. So normally a TOC depot will have routes and trains that they drive, and that is all they will do. For example, a South Eastern driver based at Hastings will only drive trains on the line between Hastings and Charing Cross, and maybe one or two smaller routes. Freight routes, on the other hand, are often more varied and sometimes longer than most passenger lines, and with the work being so dynamic, you may find yourself learning new routes and forms of traction more often than you would at a passenger company. It could be that a short-term contract has come up and you need to learn a certain route to cover it, or your company is hiring additional locomotives to cover work that you need to learn. There's also the possibility that you may get asked to work in a different part of the country to help cover the service, or act as a traction or route conductor. For example, your company could land, I live in the south of England, my company could land a contract in Scotland. Might only be a short-term contract and they might need to draft guys in from other areas to cover it. So you would go up there, you'd stay in a hotel for the duration and learn to cover the work. Passenger companies, so you're generally quite limited by what the franchise says, whereas freight companies, it's an open market, free to compete for whatever work they feel like doing, and as a driver you'll need to learn what you need to do, what's necessary to cover those contracts. So I think the point here definitely goes to, for me anyway, goes to freight work for the variety of routes and the chance of changing and learning new things. But obviously this is subjective because change isn't for everybody. One of the downsides of the dynamic nature of freight work is that as well as gaining contracts, companies can also lose contracts, meaning that they tend to have more drivers than they need, which can ultimately result in redundancies. Normally what will happen though is the work still exists, the contract still exists, it just goes to a different company, and therefore in most circumstances, in some circumstances, freight drivers can be tooped over to the new company. This said, it's not a regular thing. It's not unheard of for freight drivers to be made redundant, but it's something that doesn't tend to happen too often in today's markets. Companies are very good at just employing the right number of staff, and most companies rely heavily on overtime. So if contracts are lost, it's your overtime that goes, not your sort of bread and butter work and your general salaried hours. Passenger work, on the other hand, because they run to a timetable, because the work is dedicated by the government, because it's franchised, if anything happens to the private company running the franchise, if they go out of business, if they go bust, then the government will step in and run the service. So passenger work tends to be a lot more secure, job security, than passenger work. So I think on this one, for job security, the point definitely has to go to passenger work. But it is worth noting, I don't think freight train driving is any vulnerable to market fluctuations and redundancies than any other private company in any other industry. I think it's more of a case that passenger train drivers are very well protected, being basically sort of protected by the government. It's not a case that freight companies are more vulnerable. So admittedly, a little bit of bias is going to start to creep in now. If you're a passenger train driver, as I was for many years, then your basic work content will be driving that train from A to B to C to D, stopping at stations, picking up passengers along the way. You might have to put the train to bed at night to berth it, to get it out in the morning, to prep it, and maybe a little bit of shunting. But your bread and butter work is going to be A to B to C to D, stopping at stations, rinse and repeat. In some ways, freight's similar. You drive from A to B, not worrying about passengers or stations, which is lovely. I say you don't worry about stations, you're normally following a stopping passenger train and stopping at every red signal before every station. When I was a passenger driver, I used to moan about the freight drivers. Now I'm a freight driver, I moan about the passenger drivers. It's just the way it is. But for me, rather than just shuttling passengers from A to B to C, I get to go to lots of different places. So one day I might be working at the docks, the next day I might be at a quarry, the next day I might be at a power station or God knows where. The weekend I could be doing engineering work, working ballast train, dropping rails, or you know, if I'm really lucky, I could be working a charter excursion train. So I think there's a lot more to freight work in terms of the work you do. The sort of the work content can be different day in, day out, week in, week out. Whereas with passenger drivers, you're driving passengers backwards and forwards, stopping at stations. With freight work, there is that much more variety. So for work content, the point's definitely going to go to freight for me. So a few probably years ago now, I made a video asking how hard is it to drive a train. And since becoming a freight train driver, I've realised that I now need to completely re-edit that video and update it, and because it's probably not relevant anymore. That was from purely from a passenger driver's perspective. Driving a freight train is much more challenging, in my opinion. There's a bit more skill and finesse driving a freight train to what there is driving a passenger unit. Now, I say unit because I don't know too much about locomotive haul passenger stock and how that works. I'm purely saying passenger units there. I'm going to do another video about the actual operational side and the driving of the freight train compared to a passenger train. But generalising, yeah, there's a few more rules you need to know to do freight trains. You need to know stuff about dangerous goods. You need to know stuff about train lists. A section of the rulebook called the White Pages, which generally doesn't apply to passenger drivers. There's a lot more to freight operations. You've got parking brakes that you need to worry about putting on. You have on some older units, to be fair. Manual uncoupling, all bits and bobs like that, which make freight operations much more interesting than passenger operations. But as much as I say that, and again, I am reading off my screen, as much as I say that, I'm actually going to draw the points even here with passenger and freight. If you like things operationally simple, then I would say go for passenger. If you like something a lot more in-depth, then go for freight. But with going for freight operations, with things being a lot more in-depth, it also carries the risk of things going wrong. And things tend to go wrong in freight a lot more than what they do in passenger, because it is so much more operationally in-depth. I'll be honest with you. Having done both jobs, I would say if you're a railway enthusiast with a passion for the railways and driving trains, and you can commit to the shift, go for freight. Definitely go for freight all the way. But that's just my humble opinion. It's more challenging, it's more interesting, but it's also more rewarding, both in terms of job satisfaction and, in my opinion, financially as well. As far as freight driving goes, I find it much less stressful than driving a passenger train, and like I said, it's just generally more interesting. Driving a passenger train, for me, I was worried about making sure I stopped at the right stations on the correct stop car mark, opening the doors on the correct side of the train, and running to time. You're literally scrutinised for kind of every minute. If you lost a minute between here and there, and they want to know why. Although we do run to timetables on freight, they tend to be a little bit more relaxed than passenger trains, normally because we're following a late running passenger train, but yeah, we won't go there. So yeah, for me, it's freight all the way. I enjoy the job. The shifts are all over the place, but it's fantastic. And the best bit about it is you get to drive proper trains if you work for a freight company. It's as simple as that. You get to drive proper trains. I wouldn't dismiss driving passenger trains working for a TOC. I had about 8 years doing it and thoroughly enjoyed it, and it gave me a really good grounding on the railway. It's often far easier to get a job on a TOC, on a train operating company, than it is a FOC. And certainly a few years driving passenger trains would act as a really good grounding for driving freight trains in the future. As much as we all like to have a bit of mess and banter, and on the railway, if you can't take banter, don't even bother applying, because it's a lot of banter on the railway. But as much as we like to have banter, them sort of versus us sort of thing, freight versus passenger, drivers versus managers, you know, us versus the world, that sort of thing. It doesn't matter. The reality is it doesn't matter if you drive passenger trains, freight trains, high-speed trains, on-track machines, or pacers. Well, maybe pacers are the exception, I don't know. But it doesn't matter. We're all part of this big railway family, and we all work hard every day to keep everyone safe. It doesn't matter what you drive, doesn't matter if you're straight, gay, black, white, it just doesn't matter. We're all part of this railway family, and as much as we all like to have a laugh and we like to have banter, we all work hard to keep the railway running safe and to keep everyone moving. As always, guys, thank you very much for watching this video. If you have enjoyed it, then please do click that like button down there and consider subscribing to Dabber Out if you haven't already. Also, share this video with your friends. If you know someone that's interested in becoming a train driver, share the vlog series. Let's get it out there. I want to make at least £20 this year off of YouTube. I don't think there's much chance of that. Yeah, but no, seriously, please do hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. If you want to check out my social media channels, you can do. They're on the screen just here now. Do feel free to message me. If I can, I will message back. I do always try my back. And yeah, any comments, leave them in the comment section below. I'm just rabbiting about nothing, so I'm going to leave it there now. Thank you very much for watching, guys, and until the next one, remember, create, share, and inspire.